It was never supposed to be opened until the year 2045. A heavy, lead-lined door tucked beneath the lowest levels of Windsor Castle, marked only by the royal cipher of a queen who reigned for 7 decades. But as the clock struck midnight on a Tuesday that felt colder than any winter in history, Prince William, now bearing the immense weight of the crown on his shoulders, turned the Obsidian Key. What he found inside didn't just rattle the foundations of the palace, it threatened to rewrite the very history of the House of Windsor. Before we peel back the layers of this century-old secret, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the truth they tried to bury. The afternoon at Windsor had started with the usual orchestrated perfection. Flags waved in rhythm, and the palace machine hummed with its practiced grace of stability and continuity. But behind that polished image, a system was reaching its breaking point. Prince William stood composed, every inch the future king, but his eyes told a different story, one of focused, intent observance that made nearby aides uneasy. He had spent months watching the patterns, the cancellations of schedules, and the eerie silence surrounding the East Wing. Silence in a family is one thing, silence in a public institution is another. William knew that for centuries, the monarchy had managed the optics to control reality itself. But the truth was being dragged out at the last possible moment. He walked toward the entrance of the Blue Room, a hidden chamber not found on any public maps or blueprints. This was the place where secrets were passed from one monarch to the next, accessed not by a digital code, but by blood. As he entered the vault, the smell of old parchment and cold stone filled the air. This wasn't a collection of jewels or ceremonial robes. It was a repository of the House of Windsor's most classified defense language. His flashlight cut through the darkness, landing on a single, sealed envelope lying on a velvet-lined table. On the front, in the late Queen's unmistakable, steady script, was a name that made his heart stop: Operation Omega. For decades, this phrase had been buried under a clause reserved for materials deemed institutionally destabilizing. William's hand trembled as he broke the seal. He realized in that instant that his grandmother hadn't just been managing a kingdom. She had been managing a warning. The first page of the document contained a line that would haunt him forever. They do not serve the crown, but watch it. This was the moment the mask slipped, and the fairy tale was replaced by a cold, breathing reality. The paper felt brittle, a relic of a time when the world was simpler, yet the secrets within were far more complex. As Prince William scanned the first few paragraphs of the Operation Omega files, the air in the vault seemed to grow even colder. This was not a document about military strategy or foreign policy. It was an internal audit of the soul of the monarchy itself. The report, dated originally in the early 1952s and updated periodically until the Queen's final years, detailed a shadow infrastructure built into the very stones of Windsor and Buckingham Palace. Operation Omega was a dormant surveillance fail-safe, a system designed to detect threats not from foreign spies or political assassins, but from within the royal bloodline and the inner circle of the palace staff. The phrase William had seen earlier, "They do not serve the crown, but watch it," referred to a clandestine group of observers, a lineage of elite security officials who reported only to the reigning monarch, bypassing the Prime Minister, the Home Office, and even the Joint Intelligence Committee. As William read further, he discovered that Operation Omega was triggered by specific verbal codes, phrases like, "They're watching from the walls." It became clear that these words were never meant to be mere metaphors. They were linguistic keys designed to reactivate an analog sensory network capable of monitoring every vibration, every temperature shift, and every hushed conversation within the royal residences. William's mind raced as he connected the dots to his young son Louis's strange behavior weeks prior. Had Louis inadvertently spoken a code he was never taught? Or was there something deeper, something hereditary in the way children of the blood perceived the environment of the palace? The documents suggested that Operation Omega was authorized during a period of intense internal paranoia, a time when the Queen Mother herself feared that the monarchy was being hollowed out from the inside. The struggle within William was visible in the way his jaw tightened. To acknowledge the existence of Operation Omega, was to admit that the royal family lived in a gilded cage of their own making, watched by eyes that owed no allegiance to the law, only to the preservation of the institution at any cost. He looked at the list of anomalies recorded in the back of the file, dates, times, and names of individuals who had been discreetly reassigned after the system flagged their behavior. This was the moment William realized he wasn't just holding a file. He was holding the blueprint of a shadow monarchy that had been operating in the dark for over 70 years. The discovery of the Operation Omega files was only the beginning. As Prince William dug deeper into the velvet-lined drawers of the Blue Room, his fingers brushed against a smaller, more discreet compartment hidden behind a false back. Inside lay a collection of journals bound in weathered leather, marked with the initials of Queen Mary, the formidable grandmother of Elizabeth II. These were not the reflections of a ceremonial figurehead. They were the desperate notes of a woman who had seen the shadows and tried to categorize them before they could consume the crown. William's pulse quickened as he turned the pages. The handwriting was sharp, almost aggressive, reflecting the iron-willed nature of Mary of Teck. He stopped at an entry dated October 1928. Queen Mary had written about a disturbance in the East Wing involving her own youngest relatives at the time. She described a phenomenon she called the Hereditary Echo, a belief that certain children born into the line of succession possess a sensory awareness that the adults have long since suppressed. The journals spoke of a specific warning: one who shall speak again what was never taught. This line mirrored almost word for word the entry William would later find in Queen Victoria's own diaries. It suggested that every few generations, a child is born who can hear the whispers of the palace, the remnants of centuries of secrets, trauma, and unuttered truths that have soaked into the very walls of Windsor. But it was the mention of the keyword Plarion in Queen Mary's notes that truly unnerved William. In her era, the term wasn't just a security code, it was a reference to an ancient, unspoken pact. Mary described Plarion as the observers who do not belong to any government, but to the spirit of the monarchy itself. She wrote of their unblinking eyes and their ability to move through the palace as if they were part of the architecture. Her warnings were clear. The Plarion are not there to protect the individuals wearing the crown, but to ensure that the institution survives, even if it means sacrificing the sanity or the privacy of the royals themselves. As William stood in the absolute silence of the vault, he realized that his son Louis's words on the balcony were not a coincidence or a glitch in security. They were a trigger, a hereditary signal that had reactivated a surveillance system designed by Queen Mary and refined by Queen Elizabeth. The youngest prince had unknowingly tapped into a legacy of internal espionage that had been active for over a century. William looked at a faded photograph tucked inside the journal, a picture of a young child pointing toward a blank wall in the East Wing. The expression on the child's face was identical to the one Louis had displayed on the balcony. For the first time, William understood that the threat wasn't a modern leak or a political rival. It was a ghost in the machine of the monarchy, waiting for a child to give it a voice once again. Just past midnight, the silence that Prince William had sought to maintain within the vault was shattered by a digital explosion. A whistleblower, operating from the shadows of the palace's own communication network, leaked a report that hit the global press like a tidal wave. The leak was titled The Obsidian Key, and it contained snippets of the very documents William held in his hands. For the first time, the world learned that Prince Louis's whisper on the balcony was not the wandering thought of a child, but a classified trigger phrase from a dormant security era. The palace immediately went into a state of defensive lockdown, triggering the Tier 31 protocol. Armed guards doubled their presence at every gate of Windsor and Buckingham Palace, and internal communications were rerouted through a private hub. But while the walls were reinforced against the outside world, the real battle was unfolding within the private quarters. Queen Camilla, furious and increasingly isolated, confronted Catherine in a closed-door meeting that aides described as breathless with tension. Camilla accused Catherine of exploiting the chaos to consolidate her own influence. She saw Catherine's sudden access to the Blue Room and the restricted archives as a direct threat to the current hierarchy. To Camilla, The obsession with Operation Omega and Louis's Hereditary Echo was a dangerous distraction that invited unwanted scrutiny onto the monarchy. She demanded that the investigation be handed over to her own loyalists, claiming that the Princess of Wales was too emotionally involved to remain objective. However, Catherine remained unnervingly calm. Her silence, which Camilla interpreted as defiance, was actually a sign of her growing authority. Catherine knew things that Camilla did, not secrets hidden in the Queen Mother's letters and Queen Mary's journals that suggested the Queen Consort was intentionally kept in the dark about the observers within. Catherine didn't need to argue. She had the backing of the security chiefs, who recognized that only a future queen of the bloodline could truly manage the fallout of a Plarion activation. As the news of the Louis Code trended worldwide, the public's allegiance began to shift unmistakably. They weren't rallying behind the formal statements of the king or the queen consort. They were clinging to Catherine, seeing her as the mother, protecting her child from a legacy of shadows. The schism between the two matriarchs became a silent war for the soul of the crown. While Camilla fought for control of the narrative, Catherine was fighting for the survival of the dynasty itself, realizing that the Obsidian Key leak was just the first move in a much larger game played by those who had been watching from the walls for 70 years. The air in the secret surveillance hub of the East Wing didn't just feel cold, it felt charged, as if a long dormant heart had suddenly started beating again. As Prince William stood before a bank of analog monitors, screens that had remained dark since the late 1950 seconds, he witnessed the awakening of Operation Omega-7. This wasn't a modern digital system vulnerable to hackers or satellite interference. It was a mechanical failsafe, built with vacuum tubes, copper wiring, and pressure plates buried deep beneath the floorboards. It was lethal in its simplicity and absolute in its design. The verbal trigger Louis had spoken on the balcony had acted as a key, turning the tumblers of a system designed to detect patterns of inconsistency. On the flickering screens, thermal signatures began to appear in parts of the palace that had been sealed for decades. These weren't the bright, clear heat maps of modern technology. They were soft, pulsing glows, ghostly traces of movement in rooms where no staff had been assigned and no guards were stationed. William watched, paralyzed, as a thermal spike moved slowly through the long gallery of the North Wing, pausing at intervals that matched the rhythm of a human stride, yet the security cameras showed only an empty, moonlit hallway. This was the ghost in the machine that Queen Mary had warned about. Operation Omega-7 wasn't just looking for intruders. It was tracking something the archives called the residuals. These were anomalies that the palace's modern, high-tech security had completely missed because they weren't looking for vibrations or temperature drops in the infrared spectrum. But the analog sensors, tuned to the specific frequency of the palace's stone and timber, were screaming. Every floorboard flexed beneath a weight that wasn't there. Every door sensor in the restricted corridors flickered as if someone or something was passing through. William realized then that the monarchy hadn't just been keeping secrets from the public. They had been living alongside something they couldn't control. The Omega-7 system was now recording data that contradicted every official patrol log. While Queen Camilla's allies were busy scrambling to suppress the Obsidian Key leak in the media, William was looking at the physical proof that the palace was occupied by a presence that didn't appear on any payroll. He picked up a direct line to the Royal Medical Unit, his voice a low whisper. He didn't ask about security or politics. He asked for the recordings of Louis's sleep patterns. When the audio was played back to him in the silence of the surveillance room, his blood ran cold. Louis wasn't just talking in his sleep. He was responding. The youngest prince was speaking in a rhythmic, archaic cadence, answering the very thermal spikes William was watching on the monitors. The system confirmed what the heart feared most. The signal hadn't just woken up the building. It had confirmed that the boy was now the only bridge between the living crown and the shadows that had been watching from the walls for 100 years. As the analog sensors of Omega-7 continued to pulse with unexplained activity, Prince William turned his attention to the most guarded corner of the vault. There, beneath a heavy silk shroud, lay the V.R.I. journals, the personal, unedited diaries of Victoria, Regina Imperatrix. These were not the polished volumes available to historians. These were the dark diaries, volumes Queen Victoria had ordered to be sealed for a century and a half because they contained truths that contradicted the rational, industrial image of her reign. William opened a volume dated 1852. His breath hitched as he read an entry regarding Victoria's youngest son. The Queen had written, in sharp obsidian ink, about the boy wandering the corridors of the East Wing in a state of trance. He had spoken of the watchers behind the stones and described a Plarion guard that existed in the spaces between the rooms. The parallels were undeniable. The age, the location, and the chillingly calm cadence of the child's speech mirrored Prince Louis's experience almost exactly. Victoria had circled one sentence twice. He is the vessel for what was never taught, a bridge to the silent ones who maintain the crown's foundation. This revelation transformed the crisis from a security breach into an ancestral reckoning. But as William grappled with the weight of history, a more immediate threat surfaced within the palace walls. The palace analysts, a shadowy group of high-level intelligence officials embedded within the royal household, began pushing for specialized observation of Prince Louis. They viewed the boy not as a child, but as a biological key that could help them map the forgotten corridors and hidden protocols of the monarchy's oldest defenses. It was at this moment that Catherine, the Princess of Wales, made her most daring move. Bypassing the king's private secretaries and ignoring the protests of Queen Camilla's allies, Catherine descended into the command center. She didn't come with pleas. She came with a maternal authority that silenced the room. She had uncovered her own piece of the puzzle, a sealed envelope left to her by the late Queen Elizabeth, marked with the word Plarion. Within it was a directive that gave the mother of the future king absolute veto power over any institutional intervention regarding her children. Catherine stood before the lead analyst and the security chiefs, her voice low but carrying the force of centuries. She declared that Louis was not a subject for study, nor a tool for their ancient systems. She officially took custody of the V.R.I. journals and the Plarion directive, effectively placing a protective shield around her son that even the highest-ranking officials could not pierce. Across the palace, the power dynamic shifted. While William sought to understand the past, Catherine was securing the future, proving that a mother's instinct was the only force capable of standing against the cold, calculated logic of the Plarion. The battle for Louis's innocence had begun, and for the first time in 70 years, the palace machine found itself facing an adversary it could not predict or control. The institution of the monarchy is built on the absolute silence of its servants, a bond of loyalty that is supposed to be stronger than any oath. But as the Omega-7 system continued to churn in the background, that bond finally snapped. Sergeant Arthur Vance, a veteran of the Coldstream Guards, who had stood watch at the East Wing for over 22 years, did the unthinkable. Without warning or explanation, he laid down his ceremonial sword, handed over his security clearance, and walked out of the palace gates. He left no letter of resignation, only a single, typed sentence on a piece of official stationery. I can no longer guard what is already inside. This great resignation sent a fresh shockwave through the command wing. Vance was not a man given to superstition or emotional outbursts. He was a machine of discipline. His departure suggested that what the Omega sensors were detecting was not just a technical anomaly, but something visible to the naked eye of those trained to see. As William reviewed the footage of Vance's final shift, he saw the sergeant standing perfectly still in a corridor, staring at a patch of shadow that seemed to move independently of the light. Vance didn't flinch. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging an old acquaintance, and then turned to leave forever. With the guards' ranks thinning and the palace analysts still reeling from Catherine's clarion directive, William and Catherine realized they had to find the physical anchor of this crisis. Following a hand-drawn map found tucked inside the Clarion file, a map that matched the internal masonry of the East Wing, they made their way to a secluded alcove near the Queen Mother's former private apartments. This was a part of the palace where the stone was oldest, dating back to the foundations laid centuries ago. Following the map's precise coordinates, William found a loose stone, its edges worn smooth by time. As he pried it back, He didn't find old letters or jewels. Instead, he found a small, heavy box made of lead. Inside lay the physical Obsidian Key. It was not a key in the modern sense. It was a carved piece of volcanic glass, etched with symbols that predated the House of Windsor. But what truly stopped William's heart was the temperature of the object. Despite being buried in cold stone for decades, the Obsidian Key was warm, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic heat that matched the thermal spikes recorded by the Omega-7 system. Catherine reached out to touch the glass, and as her fingers brushed the surface, the flickering lights in the corridor stabilized into a steady, brilliant white. The whispers that had been recorded in Louis's room suddenly ceased. In that moment of absolute clarity, they realized that the Obsidian Key was not just a symbol of authority. It was the master control for the Plarion themselves. The whispers weren't coming from ghosts. They were coming from a living system that had been waiting for the right hands to hold the key once again. The map in the Clarion file had one final note at the bottom, written in the late Queen's own hand. The key does not lock the door. It identifies the owner. The question was no longer what Louis had seen, but what the Obsidian Key was now prepared to reveal to William and Catherine about the true masters of the vault. With the warm, pulsing Obsidian Key now in his possession, Prince William returned to the analog command center, the weight of the volcanic glass feeling like a living heartbeat against his palm. As he placed the key into a recessed slot on the main console, a slot that had remained hidden beneath a layer of dust for decades, the final layer of the vault's digital and physical defenses fell away. A hidden terminal whirred to life, printing out a series of documents marked with the highest level of classification, the Plarion Protocol. This was the manual for the Shadows. The Plarion were revealed not as a standard security team, but as an autonomous lineage of institutional guardians. They were individuals whose identities were erased upon recruitment, men and women who lived within the palace walls, but existed outside the royal payroll. Their oath was not to the king, nor to the government, but to the abstract concept of the crown itself. According to the protocol, their primary function was negative selection, the systematic monitoring of royal family members to ensure that any individual who threatened the stability or the divine image of the monarchy could be discreetly managed or neutralized. As William scrolled through the digital archives, unlocked by the key, his breath hitched. He found a directory titled Subject Observation Logs. He clicked on a file dated 1982, the year of his birth. Inside was a meticulous, day-by-day account of his own life, recorded by the Plarion. Every tantrum, every private conversation with his mother, Diana, and every rebellious thought he had ever whispered into the dark was documented with a cold, clinical detachment. They had been watching him from the moment he took his first breath in St. Mary's Hospital. But the most devastating discovery was a note appended to his file in the late 1992, signed by a senior analyst who had since vanished from palace records. It read, "Subject shows high levels of awareness regarding the stone frequency. Preemptive containment protocols suggested if the subject attempts to access the Blue Room before the appointed time." William realized with a surge of nausea that his grandmother, the late Queen, hadn't just been protecting him. She had been protecting the system from him. He had been a high-priority target of his own family's shadow government since he was a toddler. Beside him, Catherine watched the screen in stunned silence. She pointed to a section of the protocol titled The Accidental Prophet. It detailed the exact conditions under which a young heir like Louis might inadvertently trigger the Plarion system through hereditary resonance. The analysts had predicted this moment decades ago. They knew that a child of the third generation would eventually speak the trigger phrases because the palace itself had encoded them into the children's subconscious through the very architecture of their nurseries. William looked at the Obsidian Key, then at the thermal monitors showing the pulsing shadows in the hallways. He wasn't the master of this vault. He was the prize they had been guarding. And the Plarion were not his protectors. They were his jailers, waiting for the Obsidian Key to return to the lock so they could begin the next phase of their century-old observation. The hum of the vacuum tubes in the Omega-7 command center had grown into a low, rhythmic growl, a sound that felt less like machinery and more like a predator waiting in the dark. Prince William stood before the central console, the Obsidian Key, still pulsing with that unnatural, rhythmic heat. He had intended to use the key to shut the system down, to erase the Plarion from the palace walls, and free his family from a century of shadows. But as he reached for the deactivation sequence, a voice flat, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion echoed through the room. The system cannot be silenced without dismantling the crown itself. A figure emerged from the periphery of the monitors, stepping out of the deep shadows of the East Wing's forgotten archives. It was the lead analyst, a man whose face William recognized from a dozen state functions, but whose name appeared on no official record. He spoke not as a servant, but as a curator of a legacy. He explained that the Plarion were the only reason the monarchy had survived the 20th century. They were the ones who had buried the scandals, neutralized the real threats, and maintained the divine illusion that the world called the royal family. To destroy the Omega system was to strip away the only armor the House of Windsor truly possessed. "Your son is not a victim of this system, Your Highness," the analyst continued, his eyes fixed on the Obsidian Key. "He is its savior. He is the first in 3 generations to possess the frequency required to stabilize the Plarion for the modern age." William looked at the monitors, where the thermal signatures of the observers were now standing perfectly still, gathered outside the doors of Louis' nursery. They weren't there to attack, they were waiting for a commander. The price for Louis' peace was the total acceptance of the Plarion Protocol. If William turned the key to deactivate, the records of every royal secret, including those of his mother, Diana, and the late Queen, would be released into the public domain via a digital dead man's switch. Catherine stepped forward, the Clarion directive still in her hand. She realized the trap. The Plarion had designed the system so that it could only be managed by the bloodline it was watching. They had created a cycle of mutual assured destruction. To save Louis from being a vessel for the shadows, William would have to agree to become the ultimate guardian of the lie. He would have to lead the very organization that had spent his entire life spying on him. The confrontation was no longer about security. It was about the fundamental nature of the crown. Was the monarchy a family that happened to have a throne, or was it a machine that happened to have a family? In the suffocating silence of the vault, William looked at Catherine, and then at the Obsidian Key. He realized that the late Queen Elizabeth hadn't left him the key so he could free himself. She had left it so he could understand the burden of the watched king. As the Tier 31 sirens began to wail in the distance, indicating a breach in the outer perimeter by the media, William made his decision. He didn't turn the key to deactivate. Instead, he turned it to archive and protect. He accepted the shadow. He accepted the Plarion. But as the system hummed into its new, higher state of activation, William whispered a single, chilling promise to the lead analyst. "I will lead them. But the first thing they will do is find out who among you betrayed the Obsidian Key to the press." The hunter had finally become the master of the shadows, but at the cost of the very innocence he had sought to protect. A few weeks after the Obsidian Key was turned, the world saw only the polished veneer of a monarchy at peace. To the public, the Tier 31 lockdown was dismissed as a routine security drill, and the Obsidian Key leak was scrubbed from the internet by algorithms more powerful than any known to the tech giants of Silicon Valley. The media returned to reporting on gala dinners and charity events, and the royal family appeared on the balcony once more, smiling with that practiced, effortless grace that had defined them for centuries. But behind the heavy oak doors of Windsor and the reinforced glass of Buckingham Palace, the old world had been replaced by something far more calculated. Prince William had not just returned to his duties, he had become the silent architect of a new order. Under his command, the Plarion were no longer a shadow group hiding in the masonry. They were integrated into the very nervous system of the monarchy. The lead analyst was gone, replaced by a structure that reported only to William and Catherine. The Great Resignation was halted, not by force, but by a new, unspoken pact of absolute transparency between the crown and its guardians. William had fulfilled his promise. The traitor who leaked the protocol was found within hours, a senior official whose removal was so quiet that even his own family believed he had simply retired to a remote estate in the Highlands. But the most profound change was not in the security protocols, but in the nursery. Prince Louis had returned to his routine of tutors and playdates, but his drawings had changed. He no longer drew the simple trees or cars of a 5-year-old. Instead, he filled sketchbooks with intricate patterns of eyes, stone corridors, and men in uniforms that hadn't been worn since the 19th century, the same figures Arthur Vance had seen in the shadows. Royal physicians noted that Louis's resting heart rate now perfectly synchronized with the low-frequency hum of the Omega-7 system. He wasn't distressed. He was calibrated. He had become the living sensor the institution had waited 100 years for. One evening, as the sun set over the long walk at Windsor, Catherine found William in the Blue Room. He wasn't reading the V, R, I journals or scanning the monitors. He was simply staring at the Obsidian Key, which now sat in a display case made of reinforced glass. He told her that he finally understood why his grandmother had carried the weight so stoically. The monarchy was not a family that owned a palace. It was an ancient, self-preserving organism that used the family to stay alive. The price of the crown was the total surrender of the self to the machine. They were no longer just William and Catherine. They were the high priests of a secret that the world could never be allowed to know. As the palace curtains fall on this chapter, a single question remains for us all. Will the monarchy continue to silence the whisper, or have they finally accepted that the voice of a child was the only thing that could save them from their own darkness? As Louis was being tucked into bed that final night, a voice monitor recorded one last, soft sentence before he drifted into sleep. It wasn't a warning, and it wasn't a code. He simply whispered, "We're ready now." The system hummed in response, a silent acknowledgement from the walls themselves. The era of the Watched King has begun, and the shadows are no longer watching from the outside. They are finally home.